Well, hello there. Welcome to Defining Disney, where we seek the answer to the ultimate question: what is the best Disney animated movie? I'm your host, Caroline, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Nicole.
Hi.
And our guest host, Bree.
Hi.
Our goal today is to use an objective rubric with scoring broken down to single points to score and rank each movie in Disney's animated canon and bring our findings to you. Today we're going to be talking about Brother Bear, an early 2000s tale of the three brothers who seek to find their place in the world and have a little bit of a roundabout way of doing it. If you haven't seen Brother Bear, we highly recommend you stop now. We love having you, but there are about to be some major spoilers discussed in depth. This movie's been around for almost 2 decades, so if you haven't seen it, go around, load up Disney Plus, watch it, and then come back. We'll be here. Now, we're going to talk about this movie in terms of 8 main categories: overall story, music, character development, theming, cinematography, popularity, impact on Hollywood, and our bonus category, quotability. Starting with overall story, we have 4 different criteria here that we talk about. The story structure, so having a beginning, middle, and end, including the climax. The protagonist versus antagonist. The role of dialogue in story development, and the feels factor. Starting with story structure, I think it starts off pretty clear. You have that really solid opening all the way through Kenai's transformation, and there's a very clear shift there.
Yeah, and we'll talk about it once we get down to some of our later categories, talking about, innovations and precedents. But the aspect ratio physically changes once that transformation happens. So it's clear from the story writers and the animators that this is where the shift of the story really begins.
Definitely. And I think one of the strongest things in this opening segment is really the introduction to the 3 brothers, getting to see their dynamic and learning about their totems and how those connect to the journeys that they're about to be set on. In the middle, obviously you start with Kenai waking up as a bear, and then you get all the way through meeting Coda, journeying to the salmon run, and all the way through kind of that whole sequence at the salmon run. And I think it really starts to transition into the climax when Coda tells his story and Kenai starts to realize what's happening.
Yeah, I think the middle can be a little confusing in this story because there are those bolts or those jumps in action when Denahi is chasing them, because that is really what's the driving force. Yes, Kenai and Coda are going to the salmon run because that's what Coda's ultimate goal is, to meet up with his mom. But really the other driving force is going to be finding where the light touches the earth, and then also Denahi chasing after them, essentially. So there are a couple bursts of high intensity, high action bits within the middle of this section, which kind of leads you into this false sense of belief that you might be heading into the climax. But, we're mostly just in that main middle part of the story.
Yeah, the climax here is really more emotional than action, at least to start off with, because it starts off with Kenai confessing what he's done to Coda, and there's a song over top of it. We don't hear it all from Kenai's perspective, but we just heard it from Coda's, and we saw it happen from Kenai, so we don't need to hear it a third time, but it's a very different climax in that way, in that it starts with more of the emotional, and then it goes into the physical as Denahi catches up to them for the final time. And there's kind of a lull in between those 2 segments, with Coda running away from Kenai and then running into Rut and Took again and getting some perspective on maybe what Kenai said about, being brothers. Inadvertently from the 2 of them. They're not exactly wise, but they teach him a little something in there.
They're so lovable.
Right. And then Denahi catches up to them and it's full force climax again until they are fighting in the snow and Sitka comes down and reveals that Kenai is Kenai.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of emotional impact within the climax, even though it's not necessarily very action heavy. And then the ending, I think, wraps it up pretty well, because you recognize that Kenai's life is his totem, which is being a bear, and that represents love. And because of the sequence of events that have happened, in order to fulfill that totem, he is living as a bear. We get the inference that he's going to be taking care of Coda from here on out and living in the animal world, kind of being that midway liaison between the people of the village and the animal world.
Yeah, and that I think is especially driven home in the end when Tanana has him put his bear paw print on the wall next to the handprints of all of the men of his tribe that have come before. It is an emotional moment, for sure. Moving into the struggle between protagonist and antagonist, we had several different kind of theories we came up with here in terms of who is the antagonist in this film. I feel like a lot of it is Kenai being his own antagonist because his prejudices about what it means to be a bear and what bears are and what they do impede him from learning his lesson and then transforming back into a human.
Yeah, I think that is really one of the primary antagonists section is Kenai versus himself. You know, he's obviously got, once he's a bear, he has Denahi as his antagonist, and Coda views Denahi and basically all of the humans as more antagonists in the animal world. But there are quite a few things going on in this film that, you know, I'm not sure I could say that we're taking away points because nothing is really solid. Both of these main conflicts are pretty solid. It's just, you know, if we have to point out just one thing in this film, it's not possible. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's not like your typical Renaissance film, which has a villain you can point your finger at and put on merch and things like that. Mm-hmm. Brother Bear does not have that. But I think the way that they do it is really great. I mean, one thing that I really like is how the conflict, and I think this was something Nicole kind of pointed out to me, the conflict increases when Kenai and Denahi don't respect the animals and the other inhabitants of the earth. And that goes against the teachings of their tribe and the way that their village has lived in harmony with the animals in the surrounding area.
Yeah, and we see that historically with a lot of the Native American populations throughout history. There was a very deep understanding of living in harmony with the world around you, which meant the wildlife, it meant the trees and the forests and the plains, and everything around you is part of that harmonious living, and everybody plays a part of it. So when Kenai and Denahi are basically going after this bear to just get revenge on a bear doing bear things, that's really going to break up and throw out of balance that harmony that everybody lives in, and respecting, you know, what we talked about last episode, that circle of life.
Mm-hmm. And I think talking about bears doing bear things are not inherently bad, but the way that the humans view them is perceived as bad. And so the humans see the bears as the antagonists, but then because Kenai is turned into a bear, he sees bears redeemed throughout the movie. So it's really like his preconceived notions, his prejudice against bears.
Yeah, and they're fighting perspectives too. Like, it's like they don't know how the bears are. The bears might be talking to each other, but we hear roaring and growling, and we're scared of bears, and so we're intimidated by them. And the antagonist, it's like there's so many. There's Denahi fighting with his own emotions, Denahi fighting with Kenai and Coda, and I finally decided the real protagonist and antagonist is Kenai himself, about attacking himself and all his anger. He was his own antagonist.
Yeah, his anger definitely gets in the way of not just in the beginning with going after the bear that took the fish, but also got in the way throughout the movie of why did Sitka do this? I'm so mad. Why am I a bear? Just the whole thing. He stands in his own way.
He's a mess.
He is a mess. Moving into the effectiveness of dialogue in story development, I think you start out with an initial narration by someone who's supposed to be an older Denahi. It really sets the stage for the film and helps contextualize the story as kind of an oral family history. It's like he took over that elder role from Tanana for the village, and he's telling this story to the young children.
Yeah, and I like that, at least as a child when I was watching this movie, I didn't pick up on the fact that Denahi was the elder at the very beginning on my first watch through. You know, obviously it's been 17 years since since I've watched this as a child, so I don't know if that's something that is not obvious to everyone. I might have just been a dumb kid, but I like that once you get to the conclusion of the story, you recognize that Denahi is talking about his own family and his own lived experience and the lessons that are learned. I also like that Denahi's totem is for wisdom. So you know that he's going to end up taking on a role similar to Tanana and, stepping in as one of those elders eventually. But you're kind of like seeing that evolution for him as well. And you don't even know it at the very beginning, which is really nice.
That's true. I didn't realize that he took over for Tanana. I thought he was just telling a story, and being, I guess, an elder. Wow. So it's not obvious to everyone.
No, I think it's a specific phrase in there that you kind of have to catch, that he's telling this story to somebody else, but it is about him and about his brothers. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is the writers wrote that segment in English and then gave it to an Alaskan professor, and he just translated it and recorded it, and then they made that older Denahi. They didn't hire a voice actor or anybody fancy. It was the guy who was actually a native speaker of the Yupik Inuit language, which is pretty cool.
Wow. That's fabulous.
Moving kind of into the story itself, I think Tanana's explanation of totems it's short and sweet and to the point, but you really understand how important it is and how central it is to their culture, how they are supposed to guide villagers to manhood and really shape the path that they will take through the rest of their lives.
Well, you also get it from Sitka as well. Mm-hmm. It's not just Tanana that goes over that whole ceremony when, Kenai receives his totem. There is a lot of good dialogue there that helps expound upon it, but you also get it from Sitka after that ceremony, talking about how, I got the eagle of guidance and I didn't relate to that at all. When you first get your totem, you don't necessarily connect with it immediately because that's part of your journey, is to learn and to grow into that totem and to understand how it affects you and then how you use it in relation to your community.
Yeah, I think you need those two kind of different sides of it. Tanana explaining the history and the cultural significance, and then Sitka talking about how personally it worked with him to really understand what Denahi and Kenai are about to go through. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Koda a little bit. He loves to ramble. He loves to tell stories. And at first you think it's kind of just like a little personality quirk. That's what kids do, is they say, hey, remember that one time when we yada, yada, yada? There are so many kids that I know that will do that. And they just start talking and talking. And unless you interrupt them, they're just going to keep going. But it ends up actually being kind of a significant plot point because Koda starts to tell his salmon run story to Kenai when they're on their way, when about the time when On My Way is going to start. And Kenai stops him. He says, no, you should save that story for the salmon run. And if he had told it when he wanted to, we would never have gotten to the point of Kenai actually liking Koda and being friends with Koda and wanting to protect this kid.
And seeing what he did wrong and looking inside of himself and having that sit down with Koda to tell him what happened in that emotional moment.
Yeah, it's fairly decent plot armor at the end of the day because I don't know about you, but when I have a child that tries to tell me a story, they will try for the next 5 minutes, and then they'll try 20 minutes later, and then they'll try 30 minutes later. So I definitely imagine that with that passage of time, it's come up at least a dozen times. So it's interesting to see a kid say, oh yeah, I can hold it till the salmon run, and then actually wait. But
we do get a montage, so we don't know how many times he brought it up.
Yeah, that's the part of the montage that I want of how many times did he try to tell this story in reality, because it came up more than once.
It would be a lot longer movie.
Yeah.
It was the 5th or 6th most coldest night. It's such a great way to depict Koda's age, is the way that he talks and the cadence at which he speaks, because he speaks so much faster and just stream of consciousness more than anyone else in the movie.
So excited and just wants to say everything at once, but he can't. So he's just speaking really quickly, like an average 6-year-old. It keeps going.
Bree knows a little bit what that's like.
Oh my gosh. They just keep going and going. And then remember that one time I'm just going to meet up with my mom and we're going to go to the salmon run. We got lost with each other. And so he's kind of telling the story too. And it's like you feel bad for him. But it's like, dude, stop talking. You're repeating yourself. Okay. Save it.
Well, and speaking of animals talking, I think it's interesting that all the animals across the board are able to communicate with each other. Like, we see the bears talk to moose and bunnies and the mammoths and the goats and the chipmunks, but all of them can understand each other, but there's that barrier between human and animal that still exists very harshly.
That's true.
Yeah, I found that to be different than what we necessarily get with other anthropomorphic films, because normally what we see with most interactions is just communicating with your own, and there's not like the entire animal kingdom knows exactly what everybody's talking about except for humans. You know, it's either everybody's all in or, you know, it's kind of like restricted between your own like general population.
That's fair.
But I liked it. I mean, I didn't think that it was like so, you know, it was definitely a plot point, but it's definitely more consistent and logical on the human side of things, because you're like, yeah, I don't understand animals at all, but you know, animals might be able to understand everybody else all the time 100%.
Yeah. And then I think the last kind of piece that I wanted to talk about here was, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, when Kenai confesses what he's done to Coda, we don't hear it. There's music over top. And typically cutting out that much is kind of a bad thing. We don't like when they skim over dialogue like that. But you see the emotions play out on Coda and Kenai's faces. And coupling that with the music almost makes it a more powerful moment, I think. It's rather than the effectiveness of dialogue, it's the effectiveness of the absence of dialogue here. And I think that's something we don't talk about a whole lot, but I think in this moment it was really powerful.
I think it made it more emotional because you know what happened, you know the story, and Kenai is telling it in his own words, and in your head you're like, how would I tell this kid? And you're just seeing Coda's reaction to all of it. He's like in disbelief, and he's in so much pain emotionally and probably physically from the journey, and he's just exhausted, and it just breaks your heart that you would put yourself in that position where you're like, if I had to tell somebody that I killed their mother, and how?
Yeah, how would you even go about that? And you wonder, would you try and make yourself sound better? Would you try and just be blunt about it?
Yeah, they do a good job of, you know, we saw the first human side of it first time around. And then when we heard Coda's side of the story the second time around, we saw that imagery from Coda's perspective. So by the time that Kenai and Coda have to actually connect on it and put the pieces together, we don't need the story again. Seeing the emotion and the pain that they go through on it is really a better way of showing.
It's the more
at that
important.
point, right? Because you don't need to tell it. We've already gotten it twice. Right. You want to feel it at that point, and you want to see that feeling and let it play out naturally.
Definitely. And then last but not least for story, we have our feels factor category, which every Disney movie has. I think it kind of starts in the beginning, the sequence with the brothers as they're kind of picking at each other and adventuring and catching fish. The way that they interact, their whole dynamic really pulls on that family heartstring a little bit. Very much evokes some emotions, especially for those of us who have at least one sibling, because we know exactly what those things are like.
Yeah, it really establishes their dynamic and who's the leader and who's the goofball and who's the one that needs a little bit more help. There's always one.
There's always one.
There's always one in a family. So if you're the only child, you're usually all three. I do like that feeling that you get with quite a few of the music sequences, and we'll talk about music in just a little bit, but I like the joy that you get in Welcome. You know, there's a lot of good emotions and good associations with some of the music that we have in this film. And I don't know if that's just Phil Collins being a genius, or, you know, it's just me being a sucker for Phil Collins being a genius, not sure, but
I think it's both.
I have a really strong positive emotions when it comes to the Welcome song, and then also On My Way.
Definitely.
I think it's adorable.
On My Way is one of my favorite songs to put on when I'm like going on a long car trip, because it's the perfect song to start any adventure. It just perfectly encapsulates that feeling of, you know, I'm going somewhere, I've got a long way to go, but I'm really excited about going, and the journey's going to be fun too.
And Coda at the end, On My Way, in his cute little voice. It's like, I'm excited for this journey too. Not even on it.
And then, of course, we need to talk about that emotional climax that we mentioned. And
which one? There's several.
There are several. When Kenai confesses his crime to Coda, I mean, I remember the first time I watched it as a small child, I cried. I think it was probably because I was imagining what it was like to lose my mother at that point, and that messed me up. Honestly, when I would have been 10 years old when this movie came out, so like that would have had me sobbing.
Yeah, I watched it with my 6-year-old. He's like, what's he telling him? What happened? And I was like, he's just trying to tell him that he killed his mommy, but he didn't want to. He was just mad. And then we had to go into depth about just because someone does something bad doesn't make him a bad person. And so, like, having to explain that, it was, like, hard for me. And I'm sure it was hard for my 6-year-old to know his mommy's in heaven.
So for my notes for this whole climax, I said that it was borderline uncomfortable, and I think that I was right.
Yeah, right.
Because it's, I mean, understanding that you as the lead character are responsible for the death of Coda's mom is uncomfortable, because, you know, you don't actually make that connection as an audience until you're at the salmon run. You know, if you were a really good guesser, I guess you could, but I didn't get it definitely the first time through. And still, even when I watch it on the rewatch, like that moment where they both have to come to terms with what reality is very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and especially when Coda was like, and my mom was like, hide here, and she was telling that bad hunter to stop. And then it's like, what just happened? And then Kenai's realizing that he killed his mom, that was only just trying to protect Coda. But that was just one of the climax scenes. Like the first scene where the brother was trying to save his other brothers, I started crying there.
When Sitka stabs his spear into the ice to like save his brothers from the bear, sacrifices himself, like that hits you. That hits you different. He's a guardian,
and he is just fulfilling his totem, and his brothers have to go on without him and to understand that what are they going to do now? Like, do they have to get revenge? Like, how do they live without their brother? They have no idea. And then at the end...
it's hard, especially, like, when Kenai's like, I'm going after the bear, and Denahi looks at him and goes, I don't blame the bear, Kenai. Like, that line cuts you deep.
Yeah, and then he just leaves, and he's just got more anger, and he's just blinded by his anger, and he's going out, killing something, and as soon as he kills that bear, he's like, what did I just do? And at the end, where all the spirits come back, and he's hugging his brother, and he's like, I want to stay a bear, and he sees that mama bear hugging that little bear, I just bawled. I could not stop from sobbing.
Oh, gosh.
It was beautiful.
I think it was really nice that they included not just Sitka coming down to, you know, mediate between the two of them and to kind of reunite, but also that they brought Coda's mom down to, like, reassure him that everything was going to be okay, and
that the mom's
that she's still watching over him.
And right? Yeah. And then she forgives Kenai, I guess, for killing her and taking care of her boy and just bringing him into the family.
It's a whole thing.
It's just beautiful.
So overall for story, we gave Brother Bear 16.17 out of 25. Next up, we're going to talk about music, and there are 4 different criteria here as well that we're going to discuss. Difficulty and complexity, memorability, story advancement, and character development. Starting with difficulty and complexity, I love the wide variety of percussion instruments that they use to really reflect the tribal northern setting.
Yeah, agreed. Especially since this film takes place before we have a whole lot of documentation for this particular area and time frame. I like that from what we do know, they were able to lean in on the vocals that we associate with these areas.
Definitely. And those soaring, just ethereal harmonies in the sections with the spirits. And I think there's also some Yupik lyrics in there as well that you were able to pick out, Nicole.
Yeah, I was doing some research on the actual influences, and they're both Alaskan Inuit from what I can see. And Yupik that we mentioned earlier was definitely one of the tribes, and then one of them is Inupiaq. Please roast me in the comments. I'm so sorry. I'm going to butcher it. But there are lots of vocals that are taking a lot of those influences from various Alaskan Inuit languages and cultures that I think that they do a very good job of taking influence from respectfully.
Agreed.
That's true.
And I think those vocals, not just using the Inuit languages, but also the ones where it's just wordless and they're just producing sounds, really give the spirit moments that magical feeling and contribute to that spiritual center of the movie, which I think helps develop the world a little more and lean into those, the idea of the spirits that they posit at the very beginning.
Yeah, because they have their own music and like instrumental whenever the spirits are around in the whole light show. So it all connects really well.
Moving into memorability, I would say that this is not Phil Collins' most iconic work. I mean, it's no Tarzan, but I think the lyrics are still solid. The melodies are really easily stuck in your head, and they're catchy and fun to sing.
Yeah, I would say that even though this is not Phil Collins' most iconic work and it's not known as well as Tarzan, I think that he still put the same amount of love and care into it.
Oh, for sure.
And you're still getting the same quality. You know, it's still Phil Collins at the end of the day, and I think that he does a really great job of embracing the story and the culture that is represented here to provide really solid music again.
I think we said this a little bit earlier, but Welcome and On My Way are probably the most memorable songs in the whole movie. But the transformation score kind of sticks with me too. I could pick it out of a lineup and say, this is the scene from Brother Bear where Kenai gets transformed from a man into a bear.
Yeah, the transformation music is really pretty. It's one of my favorites from the soundtrack. Personally, I think that, you know, the ones that we have with vocals and with lyrics are nice, but transformation's probably my favorite.
And then there was actually a really interesting story I read online about Phil Collins' development process, because they asked him to do the music, but then kind of word trickled down that he wouldn't be singing it himself. And they brought several different people in to sing some of the different songs. Tina Turner specifically was brought in to sing Great Spirits. And then I can't remember the name of the band, but there's I want to say it's a bluegrass band that was brought in to sing Welcome, because they wanted it to sound like the bears were singing it rather than it being sung over the salmon run sequence. However, Phil did get to sing most of On My Way. I think the first couple of lines are sung by Jeremy Suarez as Coda, but he does sing some in the movie, and then over the credits is also another Phil Collins written and sung by. And
as soon as the movie started, I was watching it, I was kind of into it, listening and like watching it with my kids, and then I heard a voice and I was like, is that Tina Turner? She's in this? And so that was a big moment, and it just made you more interested because of the the high name artists like Phil Collins and Tina Turner. You always expect phenomenal work from them.
For sure. And I think vocally, Tina Turner's a great fit for Great Spirits as a song.
Mm-hmm.
She has that quality that really gives it some gravitas.
Yeah, the graveliness and like the earthy tones, it just went really well with the story.
Agreed. Speaking of story, we're now going to talk about how the music advances the story. And Great Spirits really introduces one of those main driving forces of the film, as the spirits themselves really shows how important they are to the village, and also highlights how central they're going to be to the story. Because, like, if you talk about them in the very first song in the entire movie, they're probably going to be important.
Yes, I really like Great Spirits because of the amount of work that it has to put in very early. I think it puts in like Circle of Life levels of work, because it is talking about one of the main components of the entire film that we're going to be seeing. You know, when we were looking at Lion King, shameless plug, last episode, go download it. We did talk about how the Circle of Life is really everything that drives the background storyline for that film. And Great Spirits does the exact same thing here. We know that it's a central part of the entire culture and the background story. And we know that it's going to have significance throughout the entire film.
For sure. I also think that the score throughout most of the movie does a really good job of helping along the action and really mirroring what's going on screen. I think the biggest example of that is during all of the bear fights. There are several. It really escalates and drives the conflict that's happening. And then there's also a really cool moment. I was listening to the soundtrack last night as I was finishing up my notes just to get a feel for it by itself. And Awakes as a Bear starts when Kenai awakes as a bear, because that's where the title comes from. But it goes all the way through the end of the ice cave sequence with Coda. And there's two different parts in there. One I'm going to talk about in a second. But this one samples No Way Out, which is the song that plays when Kenai confesses to Coda later in the movie. But it samples that melody right now as Kenai and Coda are curling up to go to sleep in the ice cave. And it's already hinting at what Kenai has done before any of it is revealed with that theme. You just don't know it yet. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, they do a really good job with some foreshadowing in this music and it being very subtle. And you probably don't catch it on the first listen through or the first watch through. But when you start taking apart those layers, it's pretty detailed.
Yeah, absolutely. And then going into how the music advances character development, No Way Out does such good work in terms of Kenai. It literally takes you through his arc. He goes through every stage of his realization, feeling that dark, heavy guilt surrounding him, saying, there's no way out. I can't confess this. I can't tell anybody all the terrible things that I've done. And then the last verse is finding the way out. And Kenai discovers that the only way out of the darkness that has surrounded him over this issue is to tell Coda the truth and to seek his forgiveness.
And love. I mean, if you love somebody, you're going to tell them the truth, whether or not it's going to hurt. But that's just, it's like stages of grief too. Like the anger, the resentment, it never happened. And then the recklessness, and then just taking a deep breath and realizing that you got to get through this, and you have to have other people with you to be able to do that. And that's what Coda provides for him. Oh my God.
I also think that Three Brothers is great. That's the score that runs under the beginning of the film when we're getting kind of that first exposure to Sitka, Denahi, and Kenai. And it really sets the tone for all of them, but especially Sitka. The instrumentation that they use for him very much is reflective of a bird. It's the woodwinds and those high, like, flighty sounds. It gives him that eagle feeling almost right off the bat, even before he becomes his totem spirit.
Yeah, you can tell that Sitka is very close to fulfilling the goal of his totem and being connected with his totem fully because of that music, advancing the character development, because you already have those really light, airy tones, and you can tell that he's already well on his way, whereas Denahi, Kenai, their motifs are more of like on that journey. They're a little dissonant. They're not quite in sync with their own totems.
Yeah, Kenai's segments in Three Brothers really have like a strong backbeat behind them, and it feels more adventurous rather than like centered on love or anything to do with the bear. It's almost that reckless abandon at the pace that he's going and the percussion is moving along. Particularly as an undercurrent under the scene in the river when they're canoeing / kayaking. And then I'm going to talk about Awakes as a Bear again, because this is the other really cool moment where it samples. There's a flute sample of the melody from Look Through My Eyes, which is the song that plays over the credits, but that song is all about Kenai learning to look through the eyes of a bear. It's the lesson that the spirits are trying to teach him, and it samples it right as he is talking to Tanana about, oh, hey, you're a bear. And he can't understand her. And she's saying something about the spirits have something in store for you. And that's when Look Through My Eyes starts to play in the background. And it's like previewing that lesson that the spirits are trying to teach him from the very beginning.
And Tanana, she knows what's happening.
She knows.
Everything. And she just pops up and then she just magically disappears. She's like, nope, can't understand you. Go see through his eyes. That's right. I love her.
She's a great character. So overall, for music, we gave this movie 12.5 out of 20. Moving into character development, we're going to talk about two different sides of that here. We're going to talk about the range of characters, so how well do we know them, and then the growth of characters. How do they develop over the course of the story? Beginning with range, I think it's pretty obvious here Kenai and Coda are the best developed characters in the movie. You get, I would say, 80% of the movie is screen time with them.
Yeah, and obviously as the leads, they're the ones that are going to get the most screen time, so we get the most range from them overall. But Coda is definitely more gradual, especially since we don't get a proper introduction to him until the middle of the story. So for him to still get all of the range that we have when he doesn't come in until the middle of the movie, it's pretty strong for a movie to be able to do that.
I agree. Yeah, you get little tidbits here and there as they go, but his introduction is springing Kenai from a trap. It's not, we don't learn a whole lot about him other than that he likes to ramble.
Yeah, and when he's helping him out of the trap, he's like, I can do it myself. You're just a dumb bear. This is a human trap. Human are better. And he just like slaps it and he's down. Who's stupid now?
Yeah, that's a great moment that you immediately challenges Kenai's perspective on bears. That, oh, this is a human trap. I can't, a bear's not going to be able to do anything to it. And then Coda finds where it's staked into the ground and he just goes, doink! Kenai smacks on his head.
Art. Which he deserves.
Mm-hmm. Moving into the medium development characters, I think Denahi and Sitka are big ones, obviously. They get a significant amount of development in the beginning, and then Denahi gets a different sort of development kind of as we go along, because he takes a turn for the worse.
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a turn for the worse. I think that he is on the cusp of a drastic change in his life because he has lost two brothers in his mind, and he is struggling with that reality and thinking that avenging the death of his two brothers is the logical next step. And part of that is being consumed by rage and grief. But, it's hard to say, oh, you took a turn for the worse. I mean, if you lose just one close member of your family, it's very difficult to overcome. So losing two at the same time is insurmountable for some. So to see the way that he copes is interesting. He does blame the bear ultimately after originally blaming Kenai, but then when Kenai apparently succumbs to the bear's attack, then he ultimately blames the bear and is looking for justice.
Well, it's because Kenai it's in his head saying a real man would go after the bear, and that's why he's forcing himself to avenge Kenai.
Yeah, and I think we can also talk about with the tribe almost as a character here, because that culture is so well fleshed out thanks to our primary human characters, but also how they explain the connection to the totems and the earth and the spirits. I think that in itself almost plays a character-like role.
Yeah, and again, because that harmony and that understanding, that deep understanding of how the world works in harmony with itself, that is a major plot point. And it does take on its own level of life, even though it's not a proper character. It's more of that frequency between characters and different individuals in this world.
Mm-hmm. And then on that culture note, we kind of had some trouble placing Tanana specifically as a character in terms of, is she a medium developed character or a minor character?
I made the argument for more of a medium developed character because, especially as an elder and acting as a shaman of sorts, she is where we get a lot of that history and a lot of the ability to understand the culture. So the culture is in essence living in her, and she is that human connection to it. So a lot of that depth that we get and range that we get for that overarching concept of harmony and how the world is working within itself, you can connect with Tanana.
And I definitely can see that she is really the fountain of knowledge and development for that culture of the tribe. But her personally, we don't know a whole lot other than, I think we know what her totem is. I actually can't remember now if we see it, but we know that she has one and she went on some kind of journey. And we know that she's very witty and quick on her feet because of the way that she handles Kenai once he's become a bear. But other than that, I feel like we don't know a whole lot about her personally.
I feel the same way. She has such an important role. She's an elder. She manages passing out the totems and the spirits speaking to her, but she's just not fully developed. We're expected to know, oh, she's an elder, she does all this stuff, and she tells us what we need to know, but we don't know much about her and her journey.
I don't know. She kind of sits on that line in the middle somewhere, and I think it depends on whether or not you want to characterize the culture as its own entity, or if you want to attribute a lot of that to Tanana because she is the human embodiment of that entity. Moving on to the characters we definitely know are minor. Rhett and Took are hilarious and get a surprising amount of screen time for as little as we know about them.
They're so fun. They're back and forth. That's sibling rivalry right there.
Yeah,
I love them. They provide a really nice bit of comedic relief within the film, because you have, especially when you're first introduced to him, you've had a lot of very serious story going on beforehand. So having that comedic relief right after and associating those two really only with comedy and humor is nice. And it's a nice reprieve from the deep topics that we'd had earlier.
Yes, there's several moments in particular that you really kind of feel like you need that breath, and here they come to provide that. I also want to talk a little bit about Koda's mom. Her death is such a loss that is so heavily felt in many characters in the movie, but we don't know anything about her. All we know is that she's Koda's mom. Mm-hmm. And she's trying to protect him.
Yeah, that was a little disappointing. They just painted her out to be this horrible monster as, I guess, the perspective of humans. And what we don't know is that she was just trying to protect her baby. And we only got that moment of, oh, she said, hide, Koda, and hide from these hunters and get back. When we heard her voice, it was like, oh my God, she's a mom. This is what the moms would do. Mm-hmm. So we didn't get any of her background or.
I do like that we get to hear her actually speak when Koda's telling the story, and we get kind of his flashback perspective. It's not all through Koda's voice. We actually get to hear her voice. and what she's saying to Coda. It doesn't tell us any more about her, hearing her voice versus his.
I guess maybe they didn't develop so much on the mom because everyone knows what it's like to have a mom, whether it's a good one or a bad one. So, well, we know that Coda lost his mom, this horrible action, and we're supposed to know how that feels.
Yeah, really the emotional hit is going to come from the fact that you know Coda so well. And the fact that he references his mom so frequently. You can tell that Coda's on the younger side, and you can tell that his mom plays a critical role in his life. So as you emotionally invest yourself into Coda, you're also emotionally invested in his mother. So even though we don't get a whole lot of range for Coda's mom, she is more of that underdeveloped character because she does have a very short amount of screen time. The emotional impact is still there, and it's still quite large because not only do you recognize her place in the story for Kenai, but you also see the emotional impact it has on Coda.
Yeah.
And then we have several other characters kind of throughout the movie. There's Tug, who is kind of the leader of the Salmon Run Bears. You have the mountain goats, who are hilarious, but none of them really get a whole lot of development.
Except for the old woman at the Salmon Bear Run. Oh, my husband were here. Stop telling everyone I'm dead. She was great.
That's funny, yeah. Moving into growth, Kenai is really the major arc here. He has kind of several different ways that he grows in discovering how the human and the natural worlds have to rely on each other to coexist, and that just because you have to protect yourself from bears doesn't mean that bears are inherently bad.
Yeah, he gets a lot of very solid growth because not only does he have to recognize where everyone's place is in the world, that every person, every animal has value and they have family and they all have their own place in this world together. But you also have him trying to understand and fulfill his totem, which is love. And I think that love aspect covers more of an all-encompassing love rather than, love between brothers, love between family, love for life in general. It's more of this all-encompassing, using love as your guide rather than your whims. Because Kenai's initial reaction when a bear had destroyed their basket full of salmon was, I'm going to go get my, my fish back and my basket back, and I'm going to screw this with this bear's day. And that's not leading with love. It's one of those more nuanced totems of, love is not just the flower crowns and jumping around singing all the time. It's more of an all-encompassing, leading with love, being slow to anger. There's a lot of different refined aspects of his totem that he ends up understanding.
And at the beginning, Tanana said that he is the most important totem of all because it connects all living creatures. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, he really discovers that, leading with anger, leading with something other than love is going to lead him to prejudice and then violence, among many other things. It's also going to lead him into sadness and grief.
Darkness and pain.
Darkness, yep. All of these other things. And then I think Denahi also gets some of the same sort of lesson, but rather than it being something he's learning for the first time, it's more of a reminder. He only had the vendetta against the bear because he thought it killed his brothers. Otherwise, he wasn't interested in going after the bear.
Right, yeah. His lesson was trying to navigate the waters without his brothers. And his growth was, even in the midst of adversity, where does your totem lead you? When you're up against the wall, when you're faced with grief, when you're faced with all of these barriers, are you still reflecting back to your totem? Are you taking that moment? Are you going to be leading with wisdom, which was his totem, or are you going to react with like a knee-jerk reaction and just do what you think is going to feel good in the immediate?
All goes back to that totem thing for sure. So overall, for character development, we gave Brother Bear 12.5 out of 20. Next up is theming, and we're going to talk about 4 different criteria that we look at here: setting, dialogue, costuming, and the culture and society portrayed in the film, and the rules that it sets up and how well they follow them. A setting is first, and I think we definitely have a unique environment here. They immediately set up the time and the place just from the depiction of the tribe, both where they are and how they communicate with each other.
I also think that they use I don't know if it's a woolly mammoth, but it's definitely a large mammoth type creature that Kenai is on at the very beginning. So you can definitely tell that it's not modern, quote unquote, society. It's definitely from a previous time from us, which is nice. There were those easy indicators for the slower ones like me that, were like, hey, dummy, don't forget, this is not current times.
Yeah, and then when Kenai and Koda are trying to conceal their tracks, they ride on mammoths too.
Mm-hmm.
The animators I know traveled to several places in Alaska, like Denali National Park and Kodiak Island, and I think you can really see the inspiration that came from that trip in all of the landscape throughout the movie.
Yeah, and I personally have not been to the Alaska area yet because COVID just had to rain all on my parade. Wow. I was supposed to go in 2020, but I do know from all of the pictures that I've seen from my grandparents going and my in-laws going that all of those landscapes and the weather and the sheer beauty of the wild that's out there is just perfect.
Yeah, like raw and natural in its original state. So there's not a lot of buildings or anything. So it's just the natural mountains and grass. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And there are several other Disney movies that are largely set in the wild in different biomes, but I think the fact that it is a snowy environment and also the animation style distinguish it from a lot of those movies like Rescuers Down Under or Tarzan or some of the other ones. Moving into dialogue, we kind of talked a little bit about this already, but older Denahi in the beginning is speaking Yupik, which the writers originally wrote in English and then sent to, and he wasn't even like an Alaskan language professor. He was a philosophy professor at the University of Alaska, and he is an Alaskan native, and so he has some of that Inuit heritage and knew the language and was able to translate it for them and then record it.
Yeah, and then we also get a little bit of an Inuit dialogue that's used as well by Tanana, but obviously the majority of the movie is done in English, so we know what's going on.
It would be cool to do a movie all in an Inuit language, but also a very small audience.
Caption on the bottom.
I also really like that the emphasis is placed on the language disconnect between animals and humans because they're unable to understand each other. It's kind of done for humor initially once Kenai turns into a bear because Tanana has no idea what his roars and growls mean. But then when they go back to they flash back to the scene at the glacier fighting with Koda's mom, when we see it from Koda's perspective, we hear what she's actually saying and we can hear her voice, whereas when we saw it from Kenai and his brother's perspective, from the human perspective, we have no idea that she's just telling them to go away. She's not threatening them. She's not taunting them. She's not being aggressive. She just wants them to leave her and her cub alone.
And that encourages his totem, which is love of everything connecting, because if he would have tried to understand the bear or not just gone in with anger and hate, this may have been a different story.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I got to give props real fast to my Russian bear at the salmon run. He is hysterical. I absolutely adore him. He is the perfect foreign bear to have because of the region. And he is also the reason why there is a small subsection of Russians that really find this like a cult classic to them, because they do have this Russian bear, and apparently he tells this really funny joke. And my husband has a little bit of Russian background, but it was too fast for him, so I need to have him translate it for me. But when you look up like Brother Bear GIFs, you see a whole lot of this Russian bear at the salmon run with the Russian text underneath him. So I gotta get it. I gotta get the translation for it, because he's apparently the source of why this movie is beloved by a nice subsection of Russians and Russian speaking people. So I gotta get that translation, because he's my favorite, and I don't understand a word he says.
That's awesome. Moving into costuming, I think the stuff that we see from the humans in the movie is as period and location appropriate as we are aware. The use of animal fur and antlers and carving the totems out of wood all makes a lot of sense for where they are and when they are.
I also love that Denahi says, it took me weeks to make that basket. Like, yeah, it would take you weeks to make a basket like that. You know, there's no Amazon 2-day shipping available to them. So I loved that little piece.
Yeah, I love that. And that kind of plays into the culture and society that are portrayed in the film and the rules that they set up. And I think they do a really great job, like we've kind of already talked about, of explaining the ceremonies and the rituals of the tribe and the totems and the spirits. I think all of those things are really well explained and very easily believable and well followed throughout the movie. But I also think we get a great glimpse into bear culture, particularly at the salmon run, because it's obviously depicted to be some kind of like family reunion type thing, but it's for all bears.
Yeah, it's kind of like the main place where they all gather, and you do get bits and pieces of Coda explaining to the other bears the weird, quote unquote, things that Kenai does. Like he's looking for places to go to the bathroom away from people. He's looking to like use his paws, you know, to like drink water or to like use leaves or something. There's a couple different mentions that he has in the film. And then there's also that moment when they're throwing around the half salmon to everybody to do story times. And Coda's like, didn't you play this game when you were growing up? So like, it's obviously ingrained into bear culture, this salmon game, and Kenai obviously has no idea.
Yeah, it's like what people do. They gather around a campfire and they tell old stories, and they tell one story from the whole year, because next year they'll have another story. And
yeah, I think the salmon run as a ritual is pretty cute, and also gives you the opportunity to really contrast Kenai with the other bears. Even as much as he's trying to fit in, he's not there yet.
Water. He got face to face with another bear. He's like, oh my god, a bear. And he's like, I am a bear.
He yells absolutely, screams bloody murder in the middle of the salmon run, and they're all like, you okay there?
For salmon run?
So overall, for theming, we gave Brother Bear 12 out of 15. Moving into cinematography, there are 3 different things that we look at here. The storytelling power frame by frame, the character development frame by frame, and then the beauty and creativity of specific frames. So with storytelling, the measure we like to start off with here is the montage count. I'm pretty sure there's only there's kind of a time skip, not so much a montage, when Kenai's in the trap, and you can tell that there's like a passing of time, but it's not, it just kind of fades from one into the other. It doesn't go through like a montage of different moments.
Yeah, there's a couple different time skips that we get, or, seeing those passages of time. One of them is the trap. The other is when Kenai and Coda are talking about what really happened to Coda's mom. There's kind of that like movement of time. So we're not stuck in, this 5-minute long montage of basically what's the same thing that's happening over and over again. But the one montage montages in the On My Way song. And even though it is a montage, they did also have to cover that passage of time. So it's not like we're glossing over pieces of the story. So even though it is a montage, we don't want to harp on it and say, you know, we're glossing over story bits, because those are the montages that just really irritate me personally. They had to do that passage of time, and they did also want to show, you know, things that were going on, similar to like the Meet the Robinsons montage we talked about in one of our episodes last season, shameless plug. They do have to show that passage of time, and there were obviously things that happened during it, but it's not like we're missing key elements.
Right. Yeah, they showed us all of the important parts of that journey. I also have to talk about the aspect ratio change of this film, because initially I had completely forgotten that this was a thing. So when we loaded up the movie to watch on Disney Plus and it was really boxy, I had just assumed that that was something with the PlayStation, because it was the first movie we had watched on our new PlayStation 5. And so I just assumed it was something wrong with that. But then when it shifted, when Kenai transformed into a bear and the world around him changes and becomes more colorful and more cartoony almost, it totally dawned on me that that was being used as a plot device and as a way to kind of show the difference in the two worlds in the story. And it blew my mind.
Yeah, I didn't remember that either, the aspect ratio change. And when I was doing some research on the cinematography overall, they did actually change or slightly modify the animating style when they were going from Kenai's perspective as a bear from Kenai's perspective as a human. They made it a little bit more animated, a little bit more cartoon-like, nothing like super drastic, but definitely those minor changes to make it a little bit more cartoon-like. And I really like that was included, because I think it really emphasizes that storytelling power and the different perspectives that we have, you know, from the perspective of a human as opposed to the perspective of a bear.
Definitely. I also have to mention the tracks moment. We've talked about this. I think 101 Dalmatians was the last time we talked about it. Again, shameless plug. If you haven't watched that episode or listened to that episode, go download it right now. It's from last season. They act as a plot device because they know that Denahi can follow them from their tracks. And so instead of continuing to walk everywhere, they get on the mammoths and travel that way. And it's also faster. But it really adds to that realism and also progresses and makes more imminent the threat of Denahi catching up.
Yeah, and it also gives you a brief reprieve from the On My Way montage. Mm-hmm. And I like that they also used Rut and Took in that moment too, of being like, oh, you mean those tracks? And, you know, you see all of them and it's like, okay, we need to come up with a better idea now.
And then the emphasis is placed on the cave paintings, not just in the beginning, but after the ice cave, they come across some more. It really illuminates the way that Kenai's worldview is expanding and maybe some of why it might have been so limited before, because they don't have... All of their history is oral and visual. There's no written history, and accounts of people's interactions with bears are often depicted in cave paintings, like the ones we saw after the ice cave about, you know, a man hunting a bear. And Coda says something about, look at that monster.
With a stick.
Kenai thinks he's talking about the bear, and then Coda says something about the pointy stick. And Kenai goes, that one's the monster to you. Okay.
Okay. I mean, it's, yeah. Well, he's like, well, because Kenai is like, yeah, well, he's just protecting himself from this scary bear, and the bear is scary. And then Coda, what he's really terrified is humans, because they're like ruthless killers and animals to him.
Mm-hmm.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and that's really one of those like visual storytelling moments where you don't get it in the dialogue until that moment with Coda, and you get a lot of it more on screen. Moving into character development frame by frame, we've talked a little bit about this. The animation changes when creatures are wild versus when Kenai's a bear, and we get to see them actually talking to him and interacting with him as a bear. Specifically, the eyes change, which was actually pointed out to me by my husband when the scene is animated of the brothers hunting the bear on the glacier the first time, when it's still all three of them, and she says, "Go away." When it's from the human perspective, her eyes are just black. There's no life to them. There's no intelligence to them. They're just straight black. But when Coda retells that story and they show that flashback, there's life in her eyes. And we see that change in her because she's speaking. She's more humanized at that point because we can understand her.
Yeah, the way that they're able to change the animations subtly is really nice because it does provide you with more context and more development without having to spell anything out or spoon feed it to the audience, which is really nice.
Yeah, they in that moment when he's able to understand them, it really makes them just as detailed and quote unquote human as his own people. And then last but not least, the beauty and creativity frame by frame. There are lots of great segments in this movie where you're just absolutely floored by the scene in front of you.
I really love, basically anything related to the environment that we see for the beauty and creativity. The lights touching the earth is such a beautiful moment, and we're all familiar with Aurora Borealis up there at the Northern Lights, and being able to incorporate that into the main story and seeing that built into the culture and saying that the lights touching the earth is a place that is of significance. It almost holds like a holy place for especially this village, and even the bears at the salmon run recognize that is a place of significance for them. So I really love what they're able to bring to the table for that.
Place of transformation. Yeah. And it kind of reminded me of the scene in Beauty and the Beast where he's transformed into a human and he's taken up with all that beautiful lights and stuff. And it was a huge transformation scene. And I think they brought that really well when he turned into a bear and when he turned back to a human.
Mm-hmm. Just the various different ways that both Kenai and Sitka transform at different moments, I think is creative and so smooth and seamless the way it kind of melts between animal and human. I also just love the landscapes in this. We've talked about how much research the animators did going to several significant sites in Alaska, but it makes you want to go there. Like, at this point, I don't care how cold it is. I want to go visit Alaska. This looks really pretty.
Yeah, it's on my calendar for 2021 now.
We're gonna hope and pray, man.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Alaska is on the itinerary for 2021 now. Even though it's supposed to be 2020, but it's fine. Sorry, Mom. Sorry, Dad.
Fine.
So overall, for cinematography, we gave this movie 8 out of 10. Next up is popularity, and there are 3 different measures of this that we use to gauge how popular the movie was: reviews, box office performance, and Disney's continued usage of the film. Starting off with reviews, reviewers are not super kind to this movie. Rotten Tomatoes has it at like 37%, Metacritic at 48%. But I do have to mention, Rotten Tomatoes 37 is only for critics. Viewers had a 65% rating, which is, I think, far closer to accurate.
Yeah, I don't know why critics really harped on it. Especially with some of the films. Okay, no, I think I do. Standards are a lot higher in the 2000s now that we've had, 60 years of history to go off of, and they were coming off of the Renaissance. So yeah, it's not a Renaissance film, but it's also not 37%.
No. Roger Ebert was kinder. He said, "It doesn't have the zowie factor of The Lion King or Finding Nemo, but is sweet rather than exciting. Children and their parents are likely to relate on completely different levels, the adults connecting with the transfer of souls from man to beast, while the kids are excited by the adventure stuff." And I think that's probably a pretty good assessment of how people viewed this movie, at least when it first came out.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I was a kid when the film came out, so I thought it was fine. It wasn't one of those that like I thought was one of my all-time favorites, but I can definitely see like my younger sibling really liked watching it for the bears and Rotten Took. You know, there's definitely a lot of good redeeming qualities of this movie that, you know, even if it's not a Lion King or a Finding Nemo, like there's still plenty to enjoy
and re-enjoy. Like it's easy to watch again, and it's old-fashioned, but it doesn't have like a whole bunch of imagination to it, but good, and we can watch it over again. They made a 2.
Yeah, they did make a 2, and I mean, come on, based off of our scores, it's definitely not the worst in the canon.
Oh no,
saying.
By far not the worst. Variety was a little less kind. Brother Bear is a very mild animated entry from Disney with a distinctly recycled feel because the film's characters and narrative simply fail to engage strong interest, and Tale is probably too resolutely serious to enchant small fry in the way the better Disney titles always have. That's a doozy.
I don't think that the serious nature of this film is so serious that kids can't still enjoy the adventure parts. There's definitely that whole middle section is all about the adventure to the salmon run. So yeah, there's definitely serious topics in here, but okay.
I
guess
it doesn't keep you, I think, at any age from enjoying the movie.
It's, you know, trying to compare something like Snow White, right? Our first episode, Snow White has a very serious theme at the beginning, and then the entire middle is pretty lighthearted, and then the climax and the end are a little bit more serious again. So it's not unlike for Disney movies to have some seriousness at the beginning, bring it up and have a little bit more joy and adventure and you know, that lighthearted feel in the middle, and then you delve back into the more serious parts before coming to their wrapped up conclusion with their bow.
Moving into box office, this movie only had a $46 million budget compared to the $250 million profit it made. So, like, wow. I think it did okay for itself, despite some of the critics' complaints. And I think that's kind of a surprise to a lot of people, just based on the lack of lasting power this movie had.
Yeah, it did fairly well. I mean, when we're comparing it again to Renaissance, you know, more recently after the Renaissance, Disney's not super stoked about $250 million, but, you know, a lot of studios would be happy with $250 million. You know, right. I mean, basically making up their budget 5 times over is nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah. And even in the second weekend, it still stayed strong. It held up a decent share of the market, even against other movies that had just released, like Elf and Matrix Revolution, which were both box office juggernauts from my understanding.
And it's also important to note that Brother Bear's opening weekend was kind of a shortened weekend. It actually only opened on a Saturday rather than opening on a traditional Friday or even a Thursday night, like what we see with a lot of films nowadays. So, you know, being able to hold its share or hold its own in the opening weekend and the second weekend against such huge films that we all recognize to this day is still something that's mentionable and nothing to sneeze at by any stretch of the imagination.
Parents are probably just excited to get their kids out of the house, and they're like, this is a movie that they can sit through and, you know, enjoy and laugh through. So I imagine a lot of families went.
Probably. They usually turn out for Disney in droves. And then Disney's continued usage of the film, we kind of already mentioned the studio did do a direct-to-video sequel, Brother Bear 2. That's also on Disney Plus if you wanted to go watch it. I watched it for the first time several years ago on Netflix, and it wasn't horrible. It was just kind of forgettable.
We watched it today, too, with my 6-year-old, and the whole intro, it's like, oh, it's going to be about love and, like, partnership and stuff. And so, like, you have to kind of be in the mood to watch it, but it referred back to the first one sometimes with the lights and the transformation and like Coda's mom, and it's just, there were some cute flashbacks to the first one, but Yep.
It's direct-to-video.
That's direct-to-video for you. Disney also has used the music from this movie more frequently than anything else. They used Welcome as part of the music for the 50th celebration parade at Disneyland. And then if you were ever a fan of Disney Mania in the early 2000s, hi, it's me. Both Welcome and Look Through My Eyes were covered on Disney Mania. I still think I have the Look Through My Eyes cover by Everlife in my music library somewhere. No shame.
And then, of course, Disney Interactive was still in their relative prime, so they had a video game that was released definitely on PC, and then I think of a couple other small platforms.
Game Boy Advance, and this was actually one of the first mobile platform games I think Disney Interactive tried.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But then when it comes to park presence, which is a very strong indicator of how Disney feels about this movie and its longevity, nothing. And it's really funny because there's a whole
big old goose egg.
Animal Kingdom and...
Okay, so I'm going to get on my little soapbox here. So I was briefly a cast member at Animal Kingdom for about a year. I helped open Pandora, the World of Avatar, which was one of the largest expansions of Disney World since Animal Kingdom opened in 1998. And shortly before Pandora, they started a nighttime show at Animal Kingdom called Rivers of Light. And it had a huge emphasis on... well, light, obviously, and they used the Northern Lights as an effect in the show throughout the show and projected them onto the trees behind the lake that this whole setup is on, and they didn't make any reference to Brother Bear. Zero. Nada. Not even like Sitka's eagle flying through. Just nothing. And they missed the perfect opportunity to put this movie in their parks, and I'm still very upset about it.
It wasn't Rivers of Light centered around quite a bit of controversy anyway.
Mostly because it wasn't done on time and lots of the props and boats for it kept sinking.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, they had some problems with Rivers of Light anyway, that were just way beyond using Brother Bear, which was, you know, the easy route. They decided to make everything very difficult, and Rivers of Light did not.
I'm pretty sure it's already no longer there.
Did not have staying power, for sure.
Yeah. So for popularity, we gave this movie 2.5 out of 5. Our last official category is Impact on Hollywood, and we look at 3 different measures here as well. The accolades the movie won, any innovations it made, and any precedents it set. Accolades, pretty straightforward here. It was nominated for the Best Animated Feature Oscar, which was still a relatively new category at the time, but it lost to Finding Nemo, and I think rightfully so.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nemo's a good one.
Yeah, when we get to Pixar, that one's going to score well. Innovations. This was actually, I'm not sure if it was the first Disney animated film or just the first animated film, period, to use an aspect ratio change in the middle of the film. Disney would later do it again with Enchanted a couple years following this, but this was the first time that they had really tried it and pioneered that idea.
There was a film that had done it, an animated film that had done it in the 90s, but it was like more of an indie film, if I remember correctly. So it wasn't like a huge thing, but they did, Disney did take it and run.
Oh, yeah. And then for precedents, if you guys remember, we talked a little bit in a previous episode about the studios in Orlando, the actual animation studios that were opened and then made into part of the Disney MGM Studios park, which later became Disney Hollywood Studios. But this was the last full film worked on at those studios in Orlando.
Wow.
Yeah, so not a first for the company, but definitely a last. When I was growing up, I do remember them making that announcement vaguely about how they weren't going to be animating here in Orlando anymore. So I remember that being like an end of something large, you know, when everything got moved out of Orlando to other locations.
Yeah, largely Glendale, California, is where the main studio is now.
Yeah.
But end of an era. Cool while it lasted, but the park was moving in a different direction anyway.
Aw.
Overall, for impact on Hollywood, we gave Brother Bear 1.83 out of 5. And now we're going to talk about our favorite, our bonus category, quotability, where we look at iconicity, so how lines from the movie may have transcended the film itself, and then the writing with wit, with specificity, and with character. And I think we've got some fun stories to tell on this one. So for iconicity, probably the only thing I can think of that would have come out of this movie that might have made it into the modern vernacular was, say it with me, Ko-duh.
Okay, Ko-duh.
And when we talk about that, it's one of the first quotes I remember doing with my brother so often that my mom got annoyed with us. My brother was 5 or 6 when this movie came out, and it's one of the first movies I remember quoting with him and not just at him, because he was actually old enough to do it back.
And talking like the moose, eh?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so when we move into writing here, I think Rut and Took are a gem in this movie.
Yeah, everything they have to contribute is just hysterical. If you didn't play the I Spy game with your family or your friends, I'm sorry, your childhood was missing something, because that I Spy game is a classic.
Yeah, I love because we had only ever played I Spy with colors up until that point, and so once Rut and Took had started putting it in my head that, oh, you can describe things other ways other than just besides what the color is. The like a vertical log.
Yeah.
became a common one for us.
I Spy something with bark.
Tree.
Let's play something else. And then also the 2 rams that decide to fight each other and lock horns quite a bit are also hysterical, because they're on that small cliff into the gorge looking area, and they argue with the voices that they hear, which turn out to be themselves, but they don't know that. So you see them throughout the film. No, you shut up.
No, you shut up.
And then you see them again in the credits, exhausted, in the middle of the night. No, you shut up. Because they haven't figured it out yet. Hilarious.
So overall for quotability, we gave Brother Bear 1.5 out of 5. One thing we love doing is getting feedback from our listeners. We've taken on this quest not just for ourselves, but for you. So your thoughts and opinions are very important to us. Here's what some of you had to say about Brother Bear. We had some great posts from our friends over at the Let's Chat podcast, where Bree is from. Chris Ball said, "Isn't it a guy who gets turned into a bear and he's on a mission to turn back? I recall this somehow." Yes, Chris, you're correct. That is the general plot of the movie.
I mean, basically, you got it.
He also mentioned the sequel and said, "I never understood why Disney did that to basically all of their old movies. Sequels just straight to video."
There were lots of questionable things that were done in the 2000s.
Lots of questionable direct-to-video sequels, yes. And then we also had our friend J-Bone from Discord. He said, "I have only seen parts of it myself. Biggest thing that it says is be careful what you wish for. Also, it teaches you everything and everyone has feelings. Also, how you might feel if you had lost a loved one after a fight that could have been worked out. It's a cute story from what I know." Yeah, several good lessons learned, good takeaways in there. I think losing a loved one after a fight can be definitely a good one for this movie. And just to remind everybody, if you didn't already know, we always watch every movie that we're going to cover for the podcast beforehand. So we will announce on our Twitter when we're doing our hashtag DDP Watch Nights. You can go on our website, click the button that says join our Ohana and enter your email, and you can have sent to you for free our score along guide, which will show you exactly how we score these movies down to the single points of every criterion. And you can print that out and use it to write your own notes and score along these movies with us while we're watching. So you can then send us your feedback and see what you think. Now, just because a movie gets a certain rating doesn't mean you must or must not love it. Feelings are subjective, and Disney movies are successful because they play on feelings. They're nostalgic and emotional, and that's not a bad thing. So Bree is going to talk a little bit why she subjectively enjoyed Brother Bear.
I enjoyed Brother Bear because it was for lots of reasons. It was personal for me because, I'm a mom and I did lose 2 family members when I was younger. And so that feeling of loss just reinforces the loss that I've endured. And it's can you still be okay after this? And you know what? You can be. It's a choice. And you're going to go through all this anger and pain and just want to get revenge or whatever. But that just does not do you any good. And when Kenai went after that bear and killed her, he just felt instant regret. So that just reinforces that just because you're mad, what you really need is companionship, a friend, someone to be there. And that's where Coda was involved. And he lost his mom. And, as a mom myself, I would rather go before my children, but that's not always the case. But still, losing a mom at such a young age, I can't even imagine what that was like for him. And that made me think, when I had to explain to my 6-year-old when I was watching it with him, he's like, what happened to his mom? And I said, she was trying to protect him and she went to heaven. It was horrible to try to explain it. But it's a beautiful story, and I really enjoyed it for what it was, and I think it did really well in our family, and we can watch it again.
That's awesome. So, with that being said, the goal of our experiment is to be as objective as possible. Using the categories and criteria we created, our final score is 67%.
Ooh.
Thanks so much for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, we've been the Defining Disney podcast. Please give us a 5-star rating, a great review, and don't forget to subscribe. If you didn't like what you heard, well, hey, shut up.
No, you shut up.
Now you shut up.
On our next episode, we're headed to South America as we meet the 3 caballeros on February 10th. Don't forget to check out our website, definingdisneypodcast.com, and make sure to join our Ohana. That's the only way to get our free sneak peek calendar, so you make sure never to miss an episode. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.